Right, so what we're going to talk about now is liabilities, and obviously it's a key concern for architects. So I'm going to start by asking Mark, who's our legal brain, about the position on liabilities, and how does this set of contracts, how does that deal with the architect's liabilities?
Well, we spoke a little bit earlier about the duty of care.
Yes.
And that does underpin, and I also mentioned from the insurance angle, because insurers will offer protection for wrongdoing, they'll have assessed the risk that they are insuring. And so the key is not to promise to do anything that you can't deliver, and not to promise that something will be achieved that is outside your control. And that's what the duty of care, as defined in each of the RIBA Swedish documents, does underpin. It says that the services, it makes it quite clear that the architect will perform their duties, exercising the skill, care and diligence reasonably to be expected of a member of the profession who has the requisite experience. Diligence was added. It used to be reasonable skill and care. Diligence was added, I think, 2 standard forms ago, or the last standard form, in recognition of the fact that doesn't, this case law shows that doesn't actually enhance. You can't really picture somebody standing up in court and saying, well, I only needed to be reasonable and careful, reasonably skillful and careful, and didn't have to be diligent. It's not really going to
Oh dear.
I think there is case law to show that if you say all reasonable skill and care, that is somewhat enhanced and that raises your obligation. But again, that is, I would say, sort of dancing on a pinhead. I think that basically it's accepted now through the RIBA terms, reasonable skill, care and diligence underpins everything that the architect does. And particularly where I think there is also a clause which says that certain things can't be guaranteed, that you can't guarantee that the budget is going to be met or that planning permission will be obtained. These are things that are outside the control of the architect, or are only part of the architect's responsibility. They will be dependent on other factors.
I think it's true that we can't necessarily guarantee that the budget will be met, but we clearly have a very firm duty, a fiduciary duty to the client to manage the budget.
Yes, I mean, actually, just coming in there, very often in that discussion between clients and architect, the client will say, well, the cost is very important to us. We've got to have that certainty. And the architect is not saying that simply by just saying we'll exercise reasonable skill and care to achieve that they can sort of go off on Brighton Beach with a deck chair and sort of forget about the budget. That skill and care does carry with it a responsibility to have proper regard for all things that are going to be important to a project. But you can't guarantee it in the same way as a clause which says time is of the essence. Well, yes, time might be of the essence, but it has to be clear that the architect will have proper regard in those circumstances, but can't guarantee that the programme will be met.
I noticed something perhaps you could come back to me on, and that's about the net contribution, because that's been reintroduced here.
Yes.
Could you just explain
well,
what that means for architects?
And the net contribution clause is a good example of what you were talking about, whether, what's fair and reasonable depends on, are you buying or selling? Because a net contribution clause basically says that if, say, the architect shares liability, shares culpability with another party or 2 parties, that the architect, contrary to common law, which is joint and several liability, so the law will think that if there are 3 people who are responsible for a loss, all of them are responsible for the whole loss, so that if 2 out of those 3 parties are no longer around, a client can enforce the whole of its loss against the remaining party. A net contribution clause, such as there is in the RIBA terms, goes against that and says no, the architect will only be responsible for that part of the loss that it's fair and reasonable for it to bear, having regard to its responsibility for it, and on the basis that all the other parties who are responsible have paid out their fair and equitable share, regardless of whether they have actually done that. It's a deemed provision. Now, a client will say, why should I contract out of the law of the land? That's not, if that's, that's the way it is. Meanwhile, the architect will say, no, it's not fair that we should pick up the whole tab, and we are not in as good a position as you, the client, to make sure that the people that you engage when the project is set up are of a proper standing, who will still be there if there is a problem. So it's a case of sort of negotiation, and it's back in the domestic appointment. There was concern that a net contributions clause might fall foul of consumer protection legislation, precisely because it does contract out of the law of the land. But there was case law, recent case law, where comments by the judge basically said that he disallowed that particular net contributions clause, but his comments made it clear that a properly drafted net contributions clause, such as I think does appear in the RIBA domestic standards, would have been upheld, and so that's why it's back in.
Very good. Nigel?
This is not obviously the same when the architect is employing other consultants as sub-consultants, and
No.
we've now got a specific form for sub-consultants, which I think is a great thing to have, because increasingly as architects we are being asked by our clients to be that single point of responsibility. So they don't have to have a range of separate professional services appointments with the architect, with the engineer, with the other consultants. They have a single point of contact, and increasingly we're finding that that's a role that the architect as lead designer is being asked to take on. So it's useful to have a standard form to help manage that.
A standard sub-consultancy?
Yeah.
Yeah, because what's very important there, from an insurance perspective, insurers need to sort of take on board the fact that their insured architect is going to assume this primary liability, so be responsible for all the services. And one of the conditions that insurers will, and the main condition insurers will impose, will make sure that you've got a properly back-to-back agreement with your sub-consultants, so there's no daylight between the duties that you as architect owe to the client and the duties that are owed to you by the sub-consultant.
And you were talking about how sometimes we can be on the back foot if we've started performing the services and we're still negotiating. Well, that's doubly so with sub-consultants in my experience. And to have a standard form to allow you to get that done rather more quickly is...
yeah, and actually, make one more point on that, that there's always this, if the architect is the lead consultant, the head consultant, there's always this friction. Well, do I involve the sub-consultants in the negotiations of the prime agreement with the client? Because otherwise I run the risk, if I finalise the head agreement, I run the risk that the sub-consultants won't sign up to it. So do I involve them? On the other hand, if I involve them, they're going to make all sorts of annoying points, and they don't have the responsibility to preserve that relationship with the client. They'll just give me a whole host of points that I need to make, and what do I do with them?
But of course, if you've got a fair standard form,
Yeah.
then all of that falls away.
That's right, well, yeah.
Aha. We have the solution.
Yeah, we got...
Can I ask you something that we often come up with this sort of appointment of sub-consultants, is the limit of insurance? Because our insurance, because our scope of service is quite large, so the insurance has to be reasonably large. Often a sub-consultant's scope of services is much smaller, and therefore they want to come in with a much lower insurance value. So is there a requirement or advice for that to be perfectly pack to pack?
I think the answer there is that the practice that the architect would need to check with its insurance, with what its insurance requirements are. Insurers used to be, I think, less imaginative and flexible. They used simply to say, no, it has to be, if you've got to maintain 5 million, then your sub-consultant has to have 5 million, and just keep it like that. But that is not actually necessarily realistic, because it may be quite reasonable for a lead consultant who's got a central role to have insurance at a particular level. But if you're going to a specialist sub-consultant where it's actually not common to have that level of insurance or reasonable, you can't expect it. And the alternative, if insurers are simply going to say, no, they must have that level, then the poor old sub-consultant is simply going to say, well, sorry, I can't do the job. In which case, the consultant, the architect, has to do it themselves, and that increases the risk to insurers. So I think insurers these days are a bit more flexible, but it needs to be checked. And I think they'll generally say, do what's reasonable, see what's a reasonable level, having regard to the lumber that their mishaps can put you in, and also having regard to what's normal in the sub-consultant's profession.
You do hit that in your practice, Dieter?
In what respect?
Well, you must have a lot of sub-consultants on your projects, which you do.
We try to avoid it because of many of the issues being discussed here, but I think what we have to be careful of is being a large practice with more complex projects.
Yes.
And often we are appointed as the lead designer, that there's a misconception by clients that means we are lead consultant and that we will be responsible for those other consultants. So from my perspective, the net contribution clause in the appointment is, absolutely top dollar, because it does mean that we're not taking on that liability through the common law joint and several liability. But what I think we have to be careful of is that we don't end up assuming that liability. I think as architects, we love to solve problems and we hate a vacuum, and we do all these great things with our appointments, and we set down the boundaries, we get our design responsibilities matrix, we say this is what we're going to do, this is what the other consultants are going to do. Then the other consultants don't perform. We want to keep the job going, we want to keep the client happy, yes. And we say, well, we'll just do this, and we'll just do that. And suddenly we're taking on liability that we've not been appointed to take on, and we're assuming those responsibilities.
And I think the other thing to that is to make sure that the project architect and the team understand what's in the appointment.
Absolutely.
To some extent, the terms and conditions, as we've said, a lot of the time, we don't have to have day-to-day regard to those, but they do nonetheless have to understand them, but particularly the scope of work. They've got to know what it is, and they might not, particularly in a larger practice where perhaps the negotiation of the appointments is done in one part of the practice and the delivery of the project is done in another. It's very important that project architect and their team understand what's in the contract.
There is an issue, of course, with expecting your team to understand all of this stuff, particularly if they're not RIBA trained or
Well, they're all
Part 3 or
qualified
chartered.
architects, aren't they?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, but the point is actually being able to find the right words to explain what their duties are, and be very clear about what they're not to do.
Absolutely. Well, we have a duty as the qualified architects and the charter members to make sure that all our staff are under appropriate supervision. And
Absolutely.
that puts a responsibility on us to make sure the less experienced staff and the students that are training understand all of these issues as well as the day-to-day design and project delivery.
It's a big ask, isn't it? I think not so much from the chartered architect's perspective, but it might be a big architect for somebody who, let's say you've got an architect that has a big project team, and to say your team needs to be aware of the boundaries. It is an added requirement. I don't think it's a bad thing, but we have to be aware that you've got to do that now.
But I also think in the long run, it makes our jobs easier, because it means you know from day one what you're doing, you know what the other consultants should be doing, and therefore you've got clarity. So if something does start to go slightly off, you can address it straight away, rather than leaving things to tumble and get worse.